Greetings explorers, and welcome to another old world exploration. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the city of Toledo, Ohio. And of course we can't get away from that Great Lakes area here on this channel. Much the same in this video, Toledo right on the banks of Lake Erie. And of course, if you're familiar with the channel, we like to investigate the historical anomalies with what we see in the photographs and what we're told about how history developed these locations. And as we take a quick look at the population demographics for the city, we notice that there's quite an increase going into the turn of the 20th century in the amount of people living in Toledo, Ohio. Now, if you dig into the history of this location, we have a little bit of everything as far as American history goes. We have the American War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, and then the settling of what they called Lower Quebec at the time, handing that over to the States. And then you have the Indian Wars going on in that region. You also have a dispute between the state of Michigan and the state of Ohio over the land itself. Interesting story about this location. And this is just a little snippet of a video I found on YouTube talking about the history of Toledo. They're saying that the whole region was what they called the Great Black Swamp, which I found interesting. They had all sorts of names for it. They called it Frog Town. They called it the Graveyard of the Midwest at one point, before it becomes what they call Glass City, having to do with the manufacturing of glass. Here they're showing us that it was the Miami-Erie Canal that really made Toledo the city that it was. It was two different cities at one point, and then they merged and came up with the name Toledo, which I didn't see any other reason given for the name itself. I know there's a Toledo in Spain, but no specific reason for the naming of the town other than that they decided to name it that. So I found that interesting. We have, of course, the canal narrative. We've seen that in my previous videos. And then the canal narrative all but dead by the mid to late 1800s as the railroads start to take shape. And now, of course, we pointed out that there's a problem with the historical narrative in that I think they're trying to explain away all sorts of projects that according to the historical narrative we're given, that they just don't fit the dynamics of that time period. And I think that we're seeing the same here in this area. This apparently the strip of land that was fought over between Michigan and Ohio, eventually the land becoming part of Ohio, and to this day it's known as Toledo, Ohio. Now let's take a look at, remember we're dealing with a swampland, let's take a look at some of the buildings in Toledo. Now I don't have a lot of names for some of these buildings. If I do, they should be in the photograph. But right away we're ticking all the boxes for what we consider to be old world architecture. So I would suggest Toledo also falling under that inheritor's narrative of a city that had been inherited, that was occupied by what we call maybe a previous humanity, or the diminishing of a previous humanity into what we are now. You see the same things repeating themselves here in the streets. Worn over brick type roads. You have basement windows. Again, remember we're dealing with swampland. And you have these type of structures. This would be an armory, looking much like a castle, looking very old, and obviously for the time period of the photograph, which would be right around the turn of the 20th century, this certainly does not look like a recently built building. And this one's a bit grainy. I do have a better photo of this one. This would be the Nasby building, 1892. Supposedly the first skyscraper built in Toledo, Ohio. We'll see that there are multiple buildings of this stature, if not larger, existing in this area. And incidentally, the Nasby building photograph taken from a historical narrative provided to us on a website called holytoledohistory.com, and I'll put the link in the description if you'd like to read a little bit more of that. Let's get back to the visuals. And of course, remember to keep in mind the time frame of many of these photographs and the age of the architecture that you're looking at. Now, since we were told that this was a swamp region, and really nothing like this could have been there pre-1850, really, until they drained that swamp, and the land became something that they could build structure on. But then we look at the infrastructure intact here at this early time period, and I think we're looking at older infrastructure, something that's been around longer than we're being told. We see it again here. If we zoom into the street, you can really see the wear and tear on those brick type cobble roads, and that thin layer of mud here, and a little pile of bricks as well for us. But it doesn't take much to look at the details of the architecture and think, oh, maybe I'm somewhere in the UK, maybe this is Manchester, where my historical narrative allows for such history. But we are in Toledo, Ohio. Of course, we have the streetcar narrative fully intact in Toledo. They have part of the storyline on those links that I mentioned, talking about how the first rail lines were made out of oak and how they were designed to be pulled by horses. So one of my favorite parts of the old world narrative that doesn't hold water for me. This is also a very common look that we see in a lot of these street lights here from this old world architecture. In Toledo, no shortage of these type of buildings, these column, single story or double story column type rectangular buildings, sometimes post office, federal buildings, high schools. But again, we're dealing with a basement layer as well. But again, the undertaking of building these types of structures would require so much more than the narrative has allowed for. So many of these have been just glossed over as having been built, but really having no record of them being built. And again, another visual of one of those types of buildings, of course, with a fancier top. This would be the high school. And kind of goes with what I was just saying. Very similar look to the building. And I don't know exactly what this one is, but if you have an eye for the old world, this would definitely jump out at you as something really not of that time period whatsoever. This is an old castle-like building. Looks like it's been around for quite some time. Very nice photograph too, very crisp. And then you're seeing some of the Antiquitect style architecture here. Again, early time period. Multiple buildings of many stories. Yeah, not really fitting the storyline, in my opinion. This one, I think it's a multiple discipline church, Universalist, I believe. Maybe that's what it says there. I'm just trying to read it, but quite the structure, though. Quite the structure. Old as well. This is, 20s, 30s, and this is looking like it's been there a while. Some nice photographs of Toledo. Really, these are, and all these buildings too. What are we supposed to believe that they just sprung up? That boom, that immigration boom that happens in all these cities all at the same time, is responsible for all of these structures being put up and all of this infrastructure being put in place right around that same time period, no matter where you look in this area of the world. I just don't think there's enough. It's not believable enough for my liking. That's why I like to poke around into this narrative. Here's a church looking very old. Again, the basement windows. Keeping in mind we are in swampland, supposedly. Municipal buildings looking very similar. Second National Bank. How many stories we got there? Quite a bit. look down below, we have a horse and buggy, so we're dealing with the early part of the narrative. Federal building, like I said, basement windows, looking very similar to the other buildings. Public library, I guess they decided to build a castle, call it a library. There's some architectural, historical narrative calling this the Richardsonian Romanesque style buildings, but the architect responsible is not actually does not have his name on all of these types of buildings, so a little thin veil on the narrative, I would suggest, in that regard. There's evidence of an old world civilization had been destroyed, demolished, and covered up and replaced. That's a pretty good giveaway here. We have a date on this of April 21st, 1908. And look at the structures intact here for that time period. Okay. Interesting. And there is definitely a bit of a military presence, historical aspect to that whole conflict, the War of 1812, the Revolutionary War, all that part of the historical narrative winding into the Toledo story. Just saw this one in the previous manual of technical training college. This may be the one we saw. The college just called it the Ohio building. Very early time period, though. I'm not sure what this building is supposed to be. The Toledo Blade, is that a newspaper? If you know a little bit more about the area, please throw it in the comments. Spitzer building, and you have again that break in the building we see very often in these old world structures, providing more sunlight, whatever that design purpose may be. Also bay windows here, arch windows, bay windows. This is not just your typical rectangle as we would build today. Very complicated build. YMCA and Elk Center. A lot of the YMCA is not making a lot of sense either, for what we know them as. State hospital and a chapel. Looking very mud flooded, I would suggest. You have to wonder. I mean, if you're buying the historical narrative, that's great for you. You have to wonder, why would they go to the trouble of building these types of things? Is it just a quirky, whimsical nature of the people at the time? Is that what you explain it? Is that how you explain it? Because it doesn't really make sense to add this type of detailing to builds such as this, like this type of detailing here. This is octagonal with a bit of a dome roof. You've got two of them in the front. Just to add that to a building such as this requires so much more of the build process, right from the beginning to the end, to the design phase, to the funding, to the building, to the finishing. It just does. It's illogical. And for us to just to say that's how they did it, I think we need to ask questions. Why did they do it? And are we being told the whole story? Again, why make the front here look like a castle? You're just having fun with brick and stone? You have a readily available source and some very, very skilled people in this area, so you ask them to add a bit of their old world flair, their old country flair. It doesn't make sense to me. And you have bushes and vines, and these have been around for a while. Very nice crisp photograph again. Hotel Secor, fireproof. They always throw this on to a lot of buildings of that time period, fireproof. It's like they're trying to sell us on the Great Fire narrative, that these all were sprung up after those great fires in the late 1800s. It's like to lend credence to the timeline. That's how I feel. They're trying to say, well, this was just built, and it's built fireproof. Of course it's fireproof. It's made out of brick, stone, granite. Right? Let's see the inside of this place. Hotel Secor. Let's have a look at some of the detailing. Reminding me of old world places, Austria, Germany. What is this, a marble column? Tapered, of course. Hotel Secor. Ghosts having their naps in the seats. Okay, we have the Libby High School, looking much like a castle. There's the stadium dug out of the ground. You can see there too, the stadium lower than the ground around it. Libby being the mastermind behind the glass manufacturing of this region. We'll get to a little bit more of that as we move forward. It's an old post office slated for demolition, apparently. Showing signs of age, and not just 100 years of age, especially with these building materials that age very slowly. Alright, I've got a couple here. This one's a bit fuzzy, sorry about that. The Queen of the Holy Rosary Church, again fuzzy, but notice the difference in the two. We have a bit of different features here, and we have the tower back here, and then we lost the tower, and a little bit different up here. Again, kind of grainy, but this still stands apparently, but it used to have this tower right next to it. There it is now. And I mean, if I were a betting man, and you didn't tell me what city this was in, and I looked at this and you said, how old is this structure? I'd be thinking, ooh, France we're in, and maybe they're going to give it 300-400 year age on it, and we're going to say it was built over the span of 100 years, because that's how we explain the narrative for many of those places in Europe. But it's still in Toledo, and there's no room for that in the narrative going that far back in time. So I'm sure the build date on this is much more recent. And there's a picture of the inside. A picture of a high school. Again, the trouble they go to build these high schools, putting all the detailing in here. Look at this. This is just throwing it in there everywhere. There's the same high school back when the mud flood that was still being dug out. It's all looking like it's been mudded. I like this too on the top. See that? What do you make of that? Weather vane? Those of you who are still buying the official narrative are going to tell me that's a weather vane. Sure. I think more to it than that. The way these things are put together, and the poles, and look at the detail. Spectacular. And we have, of course, that mud-flooded feel coming down the way here. Spectacular building. Speaking of yet another Toledo building, splendor. Columns up above, because that's easy to do. Don't forget the dome. Beautiful building. All right. Get through some of these. The churches, hospitals. Another one of the hospital. You get the conical roofs. A bit of spiky tops. Union Station. The railroad narrative. Picking up steam, if you will. I like this one too. I'm not sure what the building is, so look at what's going on up here. A bit grainy as we zoom in, but it's a really interesting building. Also, almost having that feeling of it being captured. You get a lot of these photos of people hanging off the windows and standing on the roofs of these places, and it almost feels like they've captured something, and they're claiming it. That's what it feels like to me sometimes. Waldorf Hotel in Toledo. There's the Women's Hospital. And there it is again. Alright, this would be automobile manufacturing plant. Quite the massive structure. You have to wonder, was this built for the purpose of constructing automobiles, or Does it date back further? Who knows? I just like to throw in these old industrial structures because I think there's something about the narrative that isn't falling in line. Here's that Libby Glass Company. Again, the Libby owns Ford Glass Company. We have another one here. This one, supposedly the display for the World's Columbian Exhibition that would be in Chicago in 1893. And this is supposedly the Libby Glass Company had their own exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair, and this is what it looked like. Not bad for temporary. Not bad at all. We have the Toledo steam plant. Apparently provided energy, electricity, power for the region. One of the largest at the time. Again, you have to look at this and ask yourself, is this much older than the historical timeline is allowing for this? And a little snapshot of what goes on inside that steam plant. Okay, so this is just a little spotlight on the city of Toledo, Ohio. Again, I suggest ticking all the boxes of the remains of an old world city, and leaving us only a shadow of what it used to be. Thanks for joining me.